on one side of the leaf versus the other side of the leaf. And so you may find values in the literature where someone's already studied your plant material and you could just put that number in. If you don't know, I would just leave it set to 1. It really doesn't make a huge difference unless you have really, really high transpiration rates. Then it can make a difference to your stomatal conductance measurement. Otherwise, it really doesn't have a huge impact. The next question on geometry has to deal with the type of leaves that you'll be working with. If you have this set to broadleaf, it will actually model what the boundary layer conductance should be for your particular leaf. And boundary layer conductance is a function of leaf area and fan speed. So we know based on the chamber you're using what the boundary layer conductance should be. If you're working with needles, we set our boundary layer conductance to a constant value that won't change based on leaf area. It will just be a constant high value. And we use that for boundary layer conductance. Do you all remember why we need to know boundary layer conductance from what Elizabeth shared this morning? It's late in the day to give you a quiz. So boundary layer conductance was important to be able to calculate stomatal conductance. So we measure the total conductance to water, and then we subtract the boundary layer conductance, and then what's left is your stomatal conductance. So if we make an error in boundary layer conductance, that's going to cause an error in stomatal conductance, which, if you remember from Elizabeth's presentation, in order to calculate our internal CO2 concentration, our CI, we have to know what our conductance is, our stomatal conductance. So boundary layer conductance is important to more accurately measure stomatal conductance, to more accurately calculate our CI value. Okay, so they are all interrelated and important to try to get as accurate as possible. Okay, another page that you'll spend some time on is leaf temperature. If you are working with broadleaves, then and you can be sure that you can get a good contact between the leaf temperature thermocouple and your leaf, then you would want this set to measure. If you have a situation where your leaf is highly dissected and you won't have a good confidence that you can touch part of the leaf to that thermocouple, or you're working with something like a needle that would be very difficult to touch that thermocouple, then you would want to use an energy balance approximation rather than trying to measure it with that thermocouple. So this is something that you need to set based on your morphology of the plants that you're working with. I know some of you might be working, I heard maize earlier and wheat. Both of those should be very easy to measure with the thermocouple. So I would use measured in that case. If any of you are working with teff, I'm not sure how easy the leaves will be to touch the thermocouple. If they're very, very narrow, it might be kind of difficult to get a good contact with the thermocouple. So you just have to see. If you're using energy balance, you do want to make sure in that situation to pull down the thermocouple so it won't touch the leaf. because that thermocouple will then do balance. Okay. So let's go ahead and keep that at measured for now, and we'll assess that as we start taking measurements. There's not really any adjustments you need to make on the next page down, leaf light. This is really designed for every light source that we offer, whether you're using it or not. You can set what the absorptance value is for that particular wavelength. The next page down is user constants, and probably you don't have any set up right now. The last time I used this instrument, I had two different constants that I had set up. And I'll show you how to do this a little bit later in the week. But for now, we'll come back to that. The very last page in the Constants tab is your Fluorometer Constants. And this is really useful for people that are combining dark adapted and light adapted measurements. And they want to calculate their quenching parameters. So some of the quenching parameters that Elizabeth talked about earlier were QP and QN. Specifically QN, non-photochemical quenching. To correctly calculate QN, you need to have a dark adapted FM measurement, or maximum fluorescence. And if you had measured it, it's pretty common to go out and take a measurement pre-dawn, before the sun comes up, measure photosynthesis and fluorescence. After photosynthesis has been acclimated to your environmental conditions, the light's been up for a while, and then take a measurement later in the day. But as a researcher, you want to be able to calculate non-photochemical quenching. So you want to combine the measurements done pre-dawn with the measurements done later in the day. And this screen allows you to easily do that. So if you had taken a measurement earlier in the day, it would be stored in a data file that you could load from the instrument's memory, and it would automatically put in these values that were measured earlier in the day. So your dark adapted photosynthesis rate, so your respiration rate that you measured pre-dawn, you could put that value in, as well as your FM and your FO. PS 2:1 is the ratio of the amount of P2 to PS1 in your particular species. Normally it's about half and half, but there are some species that are known to have, for instance, more PS1 than PS2. And if you knew that, you could go ahead and enter that value that's appropriate. This allows you to calculate ETR, electron transport rate, in a more accurate way. So for the most part, constants are really inputs for calculations. So if you think about your instrument, you have some sensors that are measuring different aspects, and then you have other parameters that are coming in that really are fixed values, or they're constants for that particular leaf, and they go into the calculations. And that's really what the Constants tab does for you. So you can kind of think about it that way. You have your environment that sets up what you want your environment to be, your constants, which are other inputs into your calculations. And then eventually, when we get over to looking at our data, you'll see it's really a combination of those things. Okay. Your stability tab allows you to define what stability looks like in your instrument. So if you were not there to collect data, and you wanted the instrument to maybe perform an auto program for you to tell the instrument how stable you want the values to be before you log data. And we'll actually use this more as the course goes on, but just so you know that that's what's there. Okay. Your log files tab allows you to open a log file. So you can open a log file. You could move data. So if I had collected data yesterday and I wanted to download it, I would do that here under Manage Files. If I wanted to look at data I had already logged, I could go to Analyze Logs, and it would allow me to look at the data or plot it. So you can kind of think of the log files as everything to do with logging. And there's some other options here that we'll come back to a little bit later in the course. You can customize what happens when you log a data point, and some of those options are here. The Auto Programs tab allows you to set up the instrument to log data automatically for you. So you can see on my screen right now, the last thing I did was the CO2 response curve. And you can kind of see how it was set up. I was controlling my reference CO2, and I started around ambient CO2. I went down to 0, went back to ambient and stayed there for a little while. And then I went to high CO2. And we'll talk more about our recommendations for doing both light response and CO2 response curve a little bit later in the course. But just to introduce you to the concept that you can have the instrument automatically do an experiment for you. So it could set a light level, wait for stability, and then log a data point and move on to the next light level. So it's possible to do that. It's also possible to create your own program. So we have an auto program builder as well. And basically you could program the instrument to do any variety of things during an experiment. And so there is really a lot of flexibility when it comes to logging data with the instrument. Okay, finally, let's go to measurements, and you will get a view of what the real-time values of your various sensors and your calculations being done in the instrument. On the left-hand side, we have our graphics, and on the right-hand side, we have more of a variable, we call it a grid. We can see the variables in a grid, whereas on the left-hand side, we can see the data in a graphical form. So to talk about graphs a little bit, it should show you what's being plotted here. Right now I'm plotting photosynthesis. My left vertical axis, on right vertical axis, I'm showing some model conductance. I turn these on and off. Zoom in, so if I want to look at things in a closer time interval, I can do that, or I can zoom out. By default, it keeps 16 minutes of time, real-time data in the instrument's memory, so I can go back 16 minutes ago and see what was photosynthesis and conductance doing. So it can be really helpful as you're learning about your plant and seeing, you know, if I change an environmental variable, how long does it take for that leaf to reach stability? So that can be really useful. If you don't want to change the time scale, but you just want to go back in time, you can use this time left button, and you'll notice the x-axis range doesn't change. It just moves the data back in time or forward in time. And if you want to go back to the way it was when you first started, you could go back to default.